are you doing? Good to have you here on this lovely Wednesday night hump here at the Upstairs to the Right Music channel. Let me make my adjustments to my lights here. Yeah, yeah, there we go. Looking good this evening. Good to see everybody. I always start out by saying thank you so much for taking the time to show up and watch this live stream, whether you watch it live or in the rerun. It means a lot to me. The fact that you take your time, your precious time, and spend a little bit of it with me. And so I just want to let you know up front that it is always appreciated and really good to have you here. Hey, Scott, how you doing, sir? Mod in the house first always. I appreciate you, man, so much. Just want to put that out front as well. Thank you so much. Um, yeah, a lot of interesting stuff going on here. First off, I'll start off by saying that little something that I thought that I had that I had on Sunday. It actually turned out to be the flu. So, you know, I've been going through the flu just as not just in my head, just a bad head flu for the last few days. So I don't know how much I'm gonna make it through this because there's a Japanese word. It's called kudo kudo pa. It means just a little dizzy minded, a little dizzy headed. So I'm going to make it. Hey, Mr. Watson, how you doing? Welcome. I'm gonna make a sincere attempt to try to get through this live stream tonight because you guys showed up. Again, like I always said, if possible, I will show up too. So if I make a few mistakes, if I'm a little bit more divergent than usual in my topics, then you guys can understand why that is and bear with me. Thank you. Um, I was just watching before I went live here KDH's new upload. You guys don't know him. KDH is like he's like the Sherlock Holmes of the guitar community. he he really solves the mysteries and gets down into the truths of things without actually being a lawyer too. It's very interesting. Actually, a really good guitar player. But aside from all that, I think that his recent upload is worth checking out, where he's talking about Reverb has been sold to the same investment group who happen to own Fender. And I'm going to read you a little bit of this because I looked up the page that he was looking at where he was talking about some of the potential changes coming up for Reverb. And one of the things that he was mentioning that I find interesting too is this second paragraph. Well, the first paragraph is we've been working to make more music making software available on Reverb so you can change up your sound even if you're limited on space or money. That's an interesting thing. So they're going to be getting into, that space. The second one, we're getting ready to pilot a new option for selling that allows you to get paid faster and drop off your gear locally without needing to create a listing or ship. So in other words, it's the way that KDH saw that is that they're going to start piloting a program where Reverb is going to start buying gear directly. They have drop-off points that they'll establish according to this, and they'll have all that ready for you in terms of your box and everything you need on that end, and they'll do it for you, include it in the price. So I find that very interesting. The potential that, and guys, go over to for far more in-depth analysis than that. I was just reading off the page where they were talking about their plans for the future. And he had brought that up, and I found that to be interesting. I had to read that for myself and read it to you guys so that you can see that too and see what you think. Um, you know, to my knowledge, doesn't one of the U.S. retailers have a program like that where Sweetwater, don't they buy gear as well, and do something like that? So maybe they're trying to pilot over in that direction. That's interesting. you know, that means they're going to have a bunch of guys on their end who, who are, are you going to get your best deal out of them? And will that eventually be the only place that you could get a deal if you want to sell equipment? I don't know. That just sounds interesting to me. That's completely changing Reverb from what it was to something very interesting. So there is that. Kumar, what can I help you with? And Scott, this one sounds like it's going to be one with you hovering your finger over the button. So let's see, Mr. Matty Two Hats, how you doing? Welcome, Ben. Hey, how you doing, guys? So yeah, I find that interesting. So please go over to Mr. Rogers back again. Please go over to KDH's channel and take a look at that if that sounds interesting to you. I didn't get to get all the way through it, but it sounded darn interesting to me. Now, over here in Europe, one thing that I will note is that with the tariff issues going on between China and the United States, where effectively uh, there's nothing from China going in or out of the United States at this moment. The European Union is saying, hey, last year here in the Netherlands alone, they had a record amount of small packages, aka Temu, coming through more than they ever had. And they are getting ready to draw up legislation here very shortly that is going to end that. So I talked about that. I said that, that production has to shift somewhere. They're going to try to shift it over here, and these guys are going to say, hell no. So again, guys, not saying to shop on Temu or AliExpress even eBay is kind of that way. But if you're going to get your stuff, I suggest you get it now. I order off of AliExpress. I've got those that Telecaster coming, as you guys know. It's on its way. It's on an airplane on its way here. But I got a set. I bought a set just, I said using that advice. Like I don't know whenever it's going to be available in the future, but I got a very inexpensive set of brass parts for the Telecaster. And see, I told you my mind is just this flu is like. Anyway, you guys know what this is. So I got a set of them, and I'm going to change the stainless steel probably on those over to these brass because I happen to like brass saddles down there. It just, I like that sound. But I got those because I said, hey, I better get it now while the shipping is free and the price is cheap, because that's coming up a moment here I see in the very near future where that is not going to be an avenue you can go down. So get your parts now. And just keep that in mind that things are changing. So if you're gonna, stock on tools, parts, pickups, or anything like that, and it's coming over from China, probably a good idea to get it now, while the getting's good. Well, everybody is here. I started off by saying that little something that I had on Sunday ended up being the flu. I had a head flu this week. It's Wednesday, so it's been about 3 days now. But I felt well enough. I didn't really get a fever or anything like that. It's just been a massive congestion and dizziness and a little absent-mindedness too. But somehow or another, I was able to put together a script and discussion for tonight based on some things that have been happening to me. As you guys know, I buy and sell vintage guitars from Japan. And this puts me in the zone where I'm constantly looking at guitars that come up, and how often those come up, you kind of get used to that. Also, you get a feel for the quality of what's available out there. Um, Collectors letting go of stuff. I got a bead on a guitar that was mentioned here. Again, Yeah, I want to talk about these things, but again, if I say it, I'll jinx myself. But just to say there is a buckaroo, that's out there. I'll leave it at that. But things like that come up. But the availability, the quality, and things like that, I've started to see. It has its ebbs and flows, but it is starting to decrease. You know, the golden age of guitar collecting. Actually, we may be in it, is the premise of tonight's discussion. Vintage guitars are drawing up. What happens next? That's tonight's discussion. Um, yeah, the golden age of guitar collecting might be coming to an end. So, um, this is just my own personal experiences and things that I'm seeing, but the vintage guitar market seems to be slightly drying up a bit. Um, And I just wonder what this would mean for collectors, dealers, and players alike. So let's break down the facts of what I have come up with. Um, I've been seeing the term drying up a lot lately on forums, dealer listings, and private seller chatter on the forums and the different places that I look in English and Japanese. And I find that very interesting. I think the first thing that we have to do is sort of qualify what really makes a guitar vintage. What is a vintage guitar? Um, Another channel, what do they call it? Casino Guitar, had that question a few days ago, which I think is another reason why I thought about this tonight. What makes a guitar vintage? Those guys are pretty nice, it seems, over in the States. And they were saying that they have a 25-year rule, which I find interesting. That means that to their mind, it's 2025 now. Any guitar made in the year 2000 is vintage by their definition. And they pointed out the fact, somewhat accurately, that by 1984 or 1985, that was about 25, 26 years from the 1959 Les Pauls, which by that era, by the mid 80s, those were considered to be vintage guitars. Of course, that vintage guitar market was fabricated because it didn't exist before. There was used guitars and there was new guitars. Then, of course, guys like Norm down in Southern California got into it, created what I believe is the genesis of the vintage market. And so that's where that is. But still interesting enough that, yeah, in 85, 25 years before that, roughly 25, 26 years is 1959. So maybe there may be something to that 25-year rule. Um, so, in my opinion, and what I've always used, and I've mentioned this before, when I'm buying things, I consider vintage to be anything that is pre 1989. Others follow the 25-year rule. Uh, I can't get my head wrapped around the fact that a guitar made in the year 2000, 1999, 2000 is vintage at this point because, I can remember that time very, very, very vividly. I was in Japan at that time, which is mind-boggling. Yeah, was I? Yeah, I was in Japan during that time for sure. Um, but it's more than about age, I really think. It really comes down to the originality, the production numbers, the brand, and the condition. You know, I got in a Diego. How you doing, sir? What's up to you? Welcome to the chat. I got in a 1978 Greco RB 700. I'm doing well. That's good, man. I'm glad to hear you, brother. Glad to hear you're doing well. Music companion. There is nothing vintage about a guitar being cut from CNC machine and assembled for $1 an hour. Yeah, I'm gonna get to that musical. I'm seeing. I can't see the companion. I'm getting to that in a minute. We're actually going to talk about that. But I do want you to keep those thoughts in mind. It's more than about age. It's about originality, production numbers, brand, and condition. And certainly, I will throw in down here down the line how it was made as well. Now you have to remember that 1978 RB700 Greco bass that I got, and it's their copy of the 4004 Rickenbacker. That was handmade, as was being alluded to here by Musical Companion. Those were handmade. Those weren't CNC guitars. Those were handcrafted at the Fujigen factory, and they have held up over time. Now, I consider those to be true vintage guitars because, much like their predecessors in the United States in the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s, they were being made mostly by hand. And I think when you hold enough of those guitars from Japan in the 1970s, you do realize that there is something there to that. I always talk about that gravitas. When you have an instrument like that in your hand, you can tell that you've got yourself a well handmade instrument. It really does show, you know. So, but then again, an 85 Tokai or JV Fender could just be as collectible as a 1960 Gibson if untouched and well documented. They are not uh, going to fetch you close to the prices of those 60 Gibsons right now. Hell, the Les Paul specials, which were basically guitars that were for students, they were student models. I saw one last time I went to the Vintage Guitar Fair for the ridiculous price of something like 17,000 euros. And I couldn't believe that. It was a nice one, granted, but my goodness, you know. But that is an issue there, you know. Whether your definition, whatever your definition, we're dealing with a finite resource. In other words, they're not making more vintage guitars. Once these are gone, they're gone. Once somebody is holding it in their collection, it's held there until that person passes it on. So, and those collections, because of the climate out there, are growing and growing. And a lot of this stuff is getting vacuumed up, hoovered up. And it's leaving the leftovers. But certainly, there is that feeling out there. Let me catch up with the chat here. Sir, if you are a music expert or musician, rack the finger style. Oh, yes, I've heard this before. You've asked us about this by you. Thank you so much. We talked about this before. Diego, how about like reproductions? Well, yeah. I mean, again, those 70s Japanese made in Japan guitars, like the RB700 I have coming here, were reproductions that not only equaled, but to make the statement just as good as, but different is the kind of feeling that a lot of people get. They feel that guys that have the original 4004 and have the RB700, their opinion, the pickups are just as good but different. The overall feel of the guitar is the same, just a little different. In other words, they're great reproductions. Scott says, my buddy missed a chance to get a good condition Ibanez UV77. Yeah, you know, and again, that's another thing is before we could be a little bit more laissez-faire about it. We could take maybe a little bit more casual, in other words, about our purchases on some of these things. But I now, if I see it, I immediately get on the horn to my agent in Tokyo and in Osaka and say to him, "We got to buy this. We got to reach out to the seller. We got to buy this because they go fast. It's going fast, guys. That Japanese market is going fast. There's a lot of guys that are getting into that right now, and great things are coming up, but it's slowing down." So again, there's a finite supply by nature. These guitars aren't being made anymore. Every year, more damaged, hoarded, or parted out. Again, I have up here, let me move this aside, wonderful bare knuckle Telecaster neck pickup, and I've got the bridge. I've added a bridge pickup here that was donated to me. And I want to use these to go into that new guitar when it comes in. But again, like I said, it's all original, and I loathe to do that. I loathe to do that, and so we'll see. But parting out is another thing that destroys those. Michael Watson, doesn't matter what kind it is, it's old enough, it is vintage. Okay, that's kind of the 25-year rule. Vintage doesn't necessarily mean desirable. Yeah, I talked about that in the last video that I did, actually, the content video. That was one of the key points, the 5 points before you buy a made in Japan guitar. That vintage doesn't necessarily mean desirable. Yeah. Does restoring a vintage guitar lose its value? Yes, it does. It then becomes something that they call player's grade. Now, a player's grade vintage guitar are great because that means that the everyday guy out there can buy it, but it's not something that a vintage collector would be interested in because there's a change of bridge, pickups, refrets even are something that's kind of frowned upon by collectors. You name it. You change one. Joe Bonamassa used to say that every scratch that you put on one of those really pricey vintage guitars, like the 58, 59s, and 60 Les Pauls, cost you $1,000, and that's just a scratch. So yeah, in 25 years, Temu guitars won't be worth anything low. They aren't worth anything now. It's amazing to me if you flip through Temu, they sell the. I don't know how it is now. I understand they're shutting down their operations in the States, but right now they started flooding their market with parts. You could put together a guitar from the parts that they sell cheaper than the actual Temu guitars that they're selling already completed. So they're not worth anything. They really aren't. We'll touch upon that again. But again, we're talking about the finite supply of other guitars, like that RB700. I mention it because, to my knowledge, that will be one of two that are at least available for sale that I know of anywhere. So, I got mine from a private seller, so there's that. Finite supply, though. Every year, more damaged, hoarded, or parted out. Many early Japanese copies and even American models are being lost to time. Floods, fires. My gosh, I wrote this line. I immediately, when I was typing this paragraph, I was drawn to the fires in Los Angeles up there in the Pacific Palisades. And the countless pieces of music history in terms of equipment, guitars, the board that, Bruce Springsteen and U2 and all those guys cut their albums on, that got burned up in the fire. And the guitars too, all the vintage guitars. They packed up as much gear as they could, but not everybody had the mindset or could do that. So over time, it's, these things, there's a lot of things. When you find a 1990s, it sounds amazing, but if you were to find a 1990s guitar that is unmolested, you've actually found something pretty rare. That's the 1990s. Imagine something from the 1970s. That means that they've had 50 years in order changing between guys. It only takes one of those guys to say, hey, it'd be a great idea to cover this thing with stickers, because that's the whole thing now. So let me put guitar stickers all over this guitar, Just takes one guy. Collector hoarding and investment behavior. Instruments are being pulled off the open market and into private collections or vaults. You guys think that people are selling off, and I mentioned that. Yeah, but there are people who are buying because they have money. The rich are getting richer. The poor are getting poorer. I don't have to get into politics to explain that to everybody. I think that's quite evident in our personal lives. Those who have had their who have things, the value of their investments are going up. If you don't have any of that stuff, you're SOL. And so a lot of investors are going into, this market, which may be a little bit of the investment guys on reverbs that are buying reverbs and why they're buying equipment directly. You you know, that may be part of that. Catching up with the chat here. Mike, what's your take on what's a survivor guitar is? You like we do that? What do you mean, Scott? Is that like an island, desert island guitar, or what survivor guitar is in terms of surviving over time? Not quite clear there. If it's desert island, then the Telecaster, if it's surviving over time, it's just like I said. It's finding that one buyer who bought it and kept it good all their lives. You have a better chance in Japan over to find that over than most places in the world because those guys are very otaku. They're very particular about their stuff, and they keep it really, 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 really nice. It was the Japanese musicians who taught me how to respect guitars and treat them a little bit better. How many vintage guitars were destroyed from not factory Floyd Rose and Kahlers? And yes, again, good point there, musical fan. Like I said, just took that one fad to come through to make one guy say, "Hey, let me put this on," you know. And that's not to even mention, and I've talked about this before, the luthiers in the 1970s who were mixing and matching Fender parts all day long. Well, this is a bad neck. Let me put it on this body and sell it as being this year, where it was they were all like Clapton's Blackie. They were all parts casters that were going out. So who's to say really most of that vintage stuff, especially outside of Japan, because that really wasn't occurring in Japan. You just don't know. That's 50 years, guys. That's minus that just leaves me I was around 8 years more than that, but I've been around in those 50 years, and if you gave me a guitar 50 years ago, I guarantee you it would not look the way that it looks right when you first gave it to me, because I just myself I would have gone through a lot of phases. So it's difficult to get original parts for certain vintage pieces, yeah, because the prices get hiked up on those. You know. I tell the story. A guy offered me in Singapore when I had the bread. He offered me $2,000 for a vintage PAF, a real PAF. And I said no because But would I have made money off of it? Yeah, it was a real deal. Would it be worth more now? Yeah, but it's just a pain in the ass. But there's just that. It was voted off. Unmodified but played. Yeah, unmodified but played is fine. That would be in my consideration a survivor guitar. Like this again, like the JV Strat, the 85 JV Strat that's coming in as well. It's been played, obviously, but it hasn't been modified at all. Everything is still original. Frets are still at, it was hardly played because the frets are like 80, 90%, which is always good. Sometimes you get these guitars in the frets all the way down to 60, 70%. And yeah, that's when it's getting rough. When the frets get to be too bad, I won't buy it because I know that it's going to need a refret. And if I do sell it on a wholesale basis, I'm going to lose ducats over that point, because the first thing the buyer is going to say to me, I'm going to have to do a refret on this. I went through that with a guitar I bought for a private buyer about a year and a half or so ago. That completely pissed me off because I bought it, told the guy it's as is. You're buying this 70s, this really dopey 70s guitar that you want. I found it for you as it says as is on my contract. He got it in and he was like, "Oh well, it needs my luthier says it needs a fret drop. What am I gonna do? What am I gonna do?" And I could have said, "Well, tough luck," and hung up the phone. But at that time and now, I just said I didn't want a bad reputation. Uh, I didn't want that to be put on me as being a dick move. So I paid for half the refret on it. And after that, I won't screw with any guitars that have that kind of issue. I won't do it. So yeah, unmodified but played with decent frets. Now, instruments are being pulled off, like I said, off the open market into private collection or vaults. Carter Vintage Guitar now has over 2,200 vintage guitars, but many are going into institutional collections or being bought as investment pieces. Um, you know, that's a fact. And, the Chicago Music Exchange, who, by the way, started Reverb, uh, you could say the same thing about them as well. Um, they're taking these vintage guitars in because they have the facilities to test them out, to keep them, store them, and do everything right by them. But the real buyers are institutional collectors. I saw this guy on a forum the other day, the Telecaster forum. He said guitar sales across the board, new and used, went through the freaking roof during the pandemic, but now things have eased up on all fronts over this last past year. So now we're seeing some stability, but inventory. And this is used. This is the vintage market. I'm not talking about what we were talking about the other night about new guitars, but this is a vintage market. Inventory hasn't caught up. A lot of the buyers bought and they're holding on to. Now, let's get into some hard stats because this is just, I don't want this just to be clickbaity or not have a true sentiment to it. I looked at some stats. Technavo stated that the global guitar market will grow by 1.84 billion by 2028. Online marketplaces like Reverb have made rare guitars accessible worldwide, but also it makes it more competitive as well. And now that they're getting into the buying end of it, it's going to be super competitive because they have deep pockets. They can buy a lot. Scott says, is now the time for a Reverb competitor to set up shop? Well, I think the hour has grown late on a lot of that stuff. I like to go down rabbit hole, guys, and that question brings up a diversion. I promise I won't take too many of these transit pathways tonight in my mind. But it seems to me that there was a period in the early 2000s mid to mid 2000s, where all these companies that now dominate the market were all being set up at the same time. And because of their market position um, that they have now, they're basically the only ball game in town, and starting any kind of competitive market to it is usually just a fool's errand. Look at Jay-Z and how he in his title, for example. That has a very 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 small insignificant marketing share, and he's really just using it so that he can launder he and his wife's numbers, and that's the truth. That's the truth of it. So no, probably not. Roger, 10 to 20 years from now, newer guitars become vintage. Try to be ahead of the curve. Well, but then again, you'd have to know what's gonna be the hot thing, from 20 years ago, 20 years from now, and hindsight being 2020, that's a tough one. And also, you have a few safe bets. You can pretty much well say, as like I do, is that the Japanese vintage guitars from the 70s and 80s are probably a safe bet as being some highly collectible guitars 20 years from now. But outside of that, that'd be a tough call. The used market is in free fall and prices are going to get a lot lower. Don't argue with me, you there at all. I'm not worried about reverb, Facebook. Yeah, again, I hate to say it. I'm over in Europe, in Amsterdam right now. But a lot of these viewpoints can be very North American centric. And from a global standpoint, no, it doesn't really matter, really. Regional drain. I want to talk about that actually. Thanks for setting that up, Roger. US, Japan, and parts of Europe are feeling the drought hardest. Dealers fighting for cleaner examples, especially on high end models. On my, Joe Bonamassa says that, it costs him $1,000 for every scratch. It costs me about 50 bucks, you know, for every scratch on the ones that I buy. And you guys know, you see my unboxing videos. I get some clean examples, but trust me, I have to sort through a lot of chaff to get, to that particular kernel. And frankly speaking, it's getting harder and harder, which is why I'm talking about this tonight. Dealers are fighting for cleaner examples all the time and asking me for it. And I'm just responding, hey, just be lucky it's in one piece at this point. Roger says, I'm definitely looking at it from an American perspective. I hear it's a nightmare in Europe to get gear, especially with VAT tax. Yeah, you know, that's one of the big fights between Europe and the United States is that VAT tax, which was one of the reasons why I don't send guitars to the States, other than for family and friends, close friends, because of those issues. And, you know, the freest trade that's occurring right now with Europe is between Europe and Asia, China and Japan. And as I started out tonight's live stream by stating that that China market's about to get cut off, the EU is cutting that off, so that leaves Japan, which is always a safe bet. But getting these dealers who are getting a lot of their guitars from the states are facing some issues, which is where I step in. I hope to say, hey, you know what? There's a whole back door over here that you need to explore in order to keep your supply up. So yeah, prices will likely keep climbing. It's supply versus demand 101 is the point of that. It's supply versus demand. And I hope to be, in the case of my company, to be on the right side of that equation. Um, Good examples, especially unmodified, are rising in value fast. You know, and I can get, I don't get turned away at the door. If I brought in, you know, I had to sell. I'll tell you how it is, how bad it is. I had to sell that Flying V to a private seller because my store buyers rejected it, or they gave me they lowballed me on it. And it was a 1999. You guys saw it, Flying V, that I did the restoration work on. It was great, but it wasn't. It had no value to it because it's not rare. Uh, there wasn't low production numbers on it, and quite frankly, they're making new ones as we speak today. So I learned from that lesson. I was able to use it for a trade in and get what I put into it out of it. But that's another avenue of guitars that I will not go down again. I won't go down those because I'm looking for rarity and things that, remember, rarity and condition are my two salient points. Steven, how you doing? Hi. Do you know much about the Fernandez TE? Yeah, the TE, that's their Telecaster. Takuya Jun and Mary model Telecaster. Yes, I know about it. What would you like to know? They're available. Yeah, I know all about it. If you're looking for one, send me an email. I'll help you find it. Um, I just got in. Speaking of T's, I just got in a Aria Pro 2 T, a Telecaster. They're a legend, early legend, made in Japan. That was their answer, low price answer to the Fender Japan Custom. So yeah, I'm really into telly. So yeah, I know a lot about those, Stephen. You can always ask me about that. Michael Watson, does wear and tear affect the value of collectible guitars quite a bit, Mike? Yeah, it does, Mike. You know, that's why I take the time to do that restoration work. I'll get the rust off, I'll take it all off, de-rust it. If there's any bent parts or like bent tuners or bent anything on it that can be bent back into shape and repaired to keep it 100%, yeah, because I lose money on selling to dealers. The dealers now, they'll buy it from you, but it's got to be pretty. It's got to be not with a lot of wear and tear, or you have to have the ability to, like I do, to make it attractive. Make it attractive. So players will turn to reissues and custom builds in my opinion, expect more demand for guitars that feel vintage but aren't 40 years old. Because again, like I said, that JV Strat that I have coming in, I just to double check my pricing on that, I can't believe it. Those guitars are going in the States and over here in Europe between $1,600 and $2,000 now. 83 Strats are going, Japanese Strats are going more for more than, or just as much as their American Pro 2s. You know, that sink in. So that lets you know that the Japanese vintage guitars are on an upward trajectory. That 20 years from now, that's that American Pro 2 you bought this year that had the same value as a Japanese Strat from 40 years ago is not going to be as valuable as that Japanese Strat is going to be 20 years from now, if you understand and follow that. So there's that. They're rising fast. And because of that, it's going to price the regular buyers out of that market. So now is the time. This telly that I got coming, that's it. Because I know I'll never get it again. And it will only increase in value. I won't lose any money on it. And I didn't pay a lot for it either. As long as I keep it nice, which is not a problem. But there is that factor. There is a demand for guitars that feel vintage but aren't. That's why I tore into I said the custom vibe. I kept saying custom, but that's to show you how tired I was Sunday. And I'm not that great of it, but the classic vibe series. I addressed that was the motivation behind that, and how the psychology behind that made people feel like they had something better than what they had. So I think this is an area where boutique builders will benefit. So will custom shop and relic artists. You know, it's weird. Guitarists want beat up guitars, but the guys that they buy them from, the shops and the stores, don't. Unless it's really, they'll take a beat the hell up 59 Les Paul any day of the week, trust me. But everything else, pretty much, well, nah. So it's a weird dichotomy. It's going to get really harder for everyday musicians to afford legit vintage gear. It really already is. Remember, I mentioned that Gibson Les Paul Special was a student model back in the 50s. It was their cheapest model. And they're going for 12, 13, 14, 15, 17 grand. Mind-boggling. Mike, do you think neck-through guitars are a bad long-term investment due to neck issues being near fatal? Yeah, man, I wouldn't be hanging too many of my guitars up on pegs on walls. I'll tell you what, every time I see that, I'm just like, wow. I know some cats dig that and whatnot, but it's better to put them in their case or on a stand, a good stand, to prevent those kind of. Other than that, if you keep it well, then no, it doesn't matter. Either a Fender with a bolt on or a Gibson with a through neck hanging up on a wall for a long period of time is not a good thing. It's just not a good thing. That's a pet peeve of mine that may or may not really apply to everybody, but that's just my thoughts. Um, I'm curious, guys. We've been discussing here in the forums about what you think a vintage guitar is. Are you seeing any or fewer deals or more expensive deals out there in your area? I'm curious. Um, you know, I'm just curious. Let me see if I can find that. I had some other notes here. So basically, what makes a guitar vintage? Why are vintage guitars drying up? Will prices keep going up? Global access. These are the key points that I wanted to touch upon tonight. Vintage versus vibe. There at the end, it has the classic vibe to it, but does it really hold up against a vintage guitar in the end? Hell no. Not even close. Comically so, no. Roger, I invest in investments, sports cars and wines. If you can learn to see ahead of the curve, yep, I agree. Um, Rather than react to the market, that's a valuable skill. Very few people can think that way. Yeah, I call it thinking at 30,000 feet. You know, some people can't see the forest for the trees. Some people can see the forest from 30,000 feet. So that's what I call that. I live on an island in the middle of the North Atlantic. I know, Scott. There's no real market here. Well, the market is what you make it. But for you, and that's really the point of number five. Point number five tonight: global access, global competition. Is that even on a small island, you have the ability, as long as you have a way of receiving and sending post, you have a way of accessing the entire world. Whereas 20 years ago, you didn't have that. So that has changed the landscape of the vintage market as well. Michael Watson, I feel the same way as you about hanging guitars up. Yeah. But I come from Southern California. Now, I grew up in Southern California where I was there for the 71 earthquake. I remember that. My earliest earthquake memory is the 71, what was that, La Mata or La Mita earthquake? It put a crack, and my parents have a grand house, huge house. And in the living room above the fireplace, it put a crack. I remember that day. And then all the earthquakes since then. And so the idea of hanging, your guitars on the wall is, to me is, just not something that that's attractive, you know, just from the way that I grew up. And anyway, you know, everything, like you know, even something as tiny as my, most guys would just have this sitting around, but, you know, my mandolin, has its own case. And I keep it in its case when I'm not playing it. When I'm not playing it, it stays in its case. Everything gets put away in its case, or if I have it out on the rack, it gets dusted and hung once in a while. It's just, again, these are the reasons why I put things away, because I want to keep them nice. I've got 2.5 dogs and 2 cats. I say a half dog because sometimes I have to sit for my neighbor, older lady, and help take care of her young dog. So I'm always very conscious of making sure that everything is put away so nothing happens to it. And if you have young children, I never had children, but I suppose it may be the same thing as well. But anyway, I learned from my Japanese musician friends to have a lot of respect for your instrument, because it's the way you make money. Um, you know, and it's just like a car. It's just something you have to take care of. Everybody wants a world for old stuff in Australia. Yeah, yeah, I know. I look at the prices, Maddie, down under, because it comes up because I'm dealing with Japan a lot, so a lot of Aussie stuff comes up, and it blows my mind. I thought the prices, you know, if I can get some of this down to Australia, I can make a killing. It'd be a matter of getting it in. That's the big problem. One of the reasons why the values are what they are. But yeah, I dig that. I'm always priced out, so don't even look. Yeah, it just gets to the point where you get priced out. Even on Japanese vintage guitars in Australia, those prices are off the charts, you know. And I deal in those. You would think a guy like me would, you know, be like, oh, that's a great market, but nah, nah. Hey, Ellie. Yeah, I'm not opening the door. I'm doing a live stream, so you're going to have to wait. Speaking of cats, my youngest one is here. Ellie, come on, come. I get to play them at the shop. Mostly vintage guitars. Don't do it for me personally. Yeah, I've had quite a few through, and as you guys know, I strum them, play them a little bit. Very few do I really love, but when I do love them, they're unforgettable. That is just the truth of it. So, yeah, those are my 9 points that I really, 8 points really, that I wanted to go through on this topic tonight. And I mentioned the fact that the growth in I kind of skimmed by that the global guitar market will grow by 1.84 billion by 2023. A lot of that growth is going to come in valuations. And as was being pointed out there, if you can look ahead and see what things are going to be going up in value, those are the things that, if you're into making those kind of investments, might be wise. However, because of that, and because there are people who can see that, and again, like I said, it seems like a lot of this was these operations were started 20 years ago, and the fruits of them are coming about now, and it's not positive for the consumer. um, you know, that market is drying up. So I just wanted to touch on that tonight. I'm surprised that I made it through an entire hour with the flu. I really didn't think that I was going to make it tonight. But it's such an interesting topic. Actually, time kind of flew by, if you excuse the pun. That's great. I'm glad that you guys kind of dug what we were talking about tonight. Because I think that if you're, you know, if you're serious about the market, always come and see guys like me. I'm here. There was somebody there earlier, Steven, if you're still out there, you were asking about the Fernandez guitars. Go to my main page here, my website. Contact me is there. You can talk to me about that. But yeah, I made it through tonight, guys. I made it through almost an hour, and I actually am glad that I did. I'm so glad also that you guys showed up. Do you think the Yamaha Studio Lords are as good as the vintage Grecos? No, I do not. Check my channel out again. I unboxed the Studio Lord, and I unbox Grecos all the time from the 70s. Please, Stephen, I really invite you to take a look. You'll answer probably 95% of your questions if you go back and take a look at some of those videos and see them in the comments that I make. And no, in my opinion, the Steel Lords are not better than the Grecos, but the Grecos are not better than the Tokais. So there's that. Politics aside, it would be interesting to see if the market changed over the next couple of years. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see all the changes that come over the not just years, my friend. I've gotten to the point where there's some aspects of this life that I think of in bricks of 3 month blocks at a time. It's that severe. There's some issues that I will only address or think ahead or deal with in 3 month blocks because within that period of time, things could change dramatically. So keep that in the back of your minds as well. All right. Thank you guys. I will see you for sure again Sunday for the Sunday night at Mike's. Oh God. Okay, it's time to quit. I will see you guys next time. Take care. Cheers, everyone. Bye bye.